In this introductory lecture video, we'll take a trip through history in order to get an understanding of how electronic music all started. What were its roots? You might be surprised by the technological musical innovations that started over 100 years ago and more. Let's take a look. For the longest time, the whole world of music was made up of relatively simple elements. There were, of course, musical instruments, which were sometimes pretty complicated mechanical devices. And these instruments were invented, made and maintained by the luthiers, who through their work essentially designed the sounds of music. The playing of the instruments was done by the musicians, who developed the necessary skills to produce pitches and tones from the instruments in a compelling and pleasing way. And there were, of course, composers who created the music to be played and who developed an underlying theory of music. But participation in music by everyone else, in the sense of listening to and enjoying it, necessarily involved attending a live performance of some sort. Then, around the turn of the century, things began to change, and the world of music started to become a little more complicated. And these were the big developments that came along. First, the recording and playback of sound and audio. Second, the development of electronic musical instruments. And third, the digital encoding of music. Throughout the 20th century, innovations with electricity, wireless, computers and digital technology all contributed to the expansion of the musical world, with a result that listening to music no longer required attending a live performance. Musical sound could be created without the use of complex mechanical devices, and composers no longer needed an orchestra or band in order to hear their creations. With this in mind, let's take a look at some of the significant electronic music-related events of the last 150 years or so that have shaped our current world of music. It all starts back in the late 1800s with the development of sound recording and playback. Sound recording and playback was a major innovation in the world of music that began with Edison's phonograph cylinder, invented in the 1870s. His invention was a mechanical device that was able to cut a representation of sound waves directly onto a wax cylinder. It was entirely mechanical, but sophisticated enough as a sound reproducing device that Edison and Columbia were able to commercialize recordings made on the device, and over a period of some 25 years sold hundreds of thousands of phonograph players and literally millions of wax cylinders. These wax cylinders typically contained extracts of musical performances, famous speeches and so on, and were about 2 minutes in length. In 1912, Columbia dropped the cylinder format but continued to support a flat record disc format which used the same underlying technology for recording and playback, but which was much easier to manufacture. And by the mid-20s, this more familiar flat disc format had superseded the cylinder. During this time, the audio output of the phonograph was listened to on horns. Now these were good, but not very loud, and again they were purely mechanical devices. Electric loudspeakers were invented along with the microphone back in 1876, but not until the mid-1920s did they look and sound like the models of today, providing a good broad flat frequency response and using electrical amplification circuitry. It was at this time in the mid-1920s that the first electrical audio recording was made. However, the actual recording method, although electrically assisted, was still essentially the same mechanical direct-to-disc cutting method that had been developed in the previous century by Edison. It wasn't until 1928, with the invention of magnetic tape by Fritz Fumer in Germany, that an all-electric system of recording and playback was introduced and developed. In the USA, Ampex shipped their first tape recorder in 1948. As a sidebar, it might be interesting to mention that back in 1940, the Walt Disney Film Company released Fantasia, which played back music in cinemas with a form of stereo surround sound. using optical recording, which actually printed sound wave images onto celluloid film. Now, this process was developed during the 1920s, but did not really become a widely available commercial proposition. It was magnetic tape recording that really opened the door to audio and sound recording and playback. And eventually, by 1950, the term roll the tape and putting down a track had become part of the recording engineers and musicians' language. By 1950, the familiar vinyl LP disc, introduced by RCA Victor in the early 1930s, was commonplace and a standard way of listening to music, with millions being sold worldwide. Record companies, rather than individual artists or theatre companies, dominated the music listening and distribution business. But music itself was becoming more cross-cultural. Music from around the world could be heard and enjoyed by anyone, without the need for attending a live performance. During this period of intense electrical and audio innovation, musical instruments and the means of playing them was also developing. So let's take a look at that before moving on to the 1960s and more recent times. So during this period up to 1950, when sound recording and music distribution was changing the musical landscape, musical instruments themselves were showing signs of a significant development, using the new electrical circuits, amplification and loudspeakers, rather than direct mechanical vibrations to produce a tone. The first electronic musical instrument that used an electric oscillator circuit to produce its sound was the theremin, invented around 1920 by Leon Sergeyevich Termin, aka Leon Theremin, who patented his instrument just a few years later in 1928, granting commercial production rights to RCA at the same time. The instrument itself produced a simple tone of varying pitch and volume depending on the proximity of the player's hands to two antennas. Here is a virtual theremin demo, just to give you an idea. A year after the theremin, the less well-known but nonetheless extraordinary onde Martineau was invented, a device using a similar underlying technology to the theremin, but it also introduced a keyboard control element to show more precisely where the pitches were. The onde certainly hinted at synthesizers to come, having different timbres, sound shapes, and used special resonant loudspeakers to color the sound. The next to arrive in 1930 and bringing us right into the mainstream of music, Lawrence Hammond creates the first Hammond electric organ, and the Model A went into production about 5 years later in the mid-30s. Now, church organs or pipe organs have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but the Hammond organ was a genuine electric organ using an electromechanical sound generation system, processed and amplified and played through loudspeakers. All of these early electronic instruments opened the door to a wave of modern commercial synthesizers that appeared from the mid-1960s onwards. But before we move along our timeline, we must finally trace our third strand of development and innovation. Slightly more obscure but nonetheless significant in its impact on current-day electronic music, our third strand of history, as it were, is the automation of music and instrument playing. This has intrigued musicians and inventors for a long time, and indeed street barrel organs played by organ grinders cranking the handle have been around since the 1700s, and the larger fairground organs made their appearance in the early 1800s. In the late 1800s, around the time that Edison and his peers were experimenting with the phonograph, Monsieur Fourneau was the first of a series of inventors who would develop the pianola, a player piano that played automatically according to instructions on a punch card-like piano roll. At first, these rolls were created by hand, with the result that the playback on a pianola was rather stilted and rigid, but by 1906, a system existed whereby an accomplished pianist could actually sit at the device, play a piece of music, and a piano roll would be automatically created, capturing all the nuances of his playing. This was an important advance of automated instrument playback. However, it was the later development of electronic instruments, which were so much easier to control, that really opened the door for computers hovering just around the corner to enter the automatic music scene. By the 1950s, musicians, composers, and academic institutions were very much involved in experimenting with the new audio technologies. Tape recording led to the concept of musique concrète, which was invented in Paris in the late 1940s and involved editing and reassembling fragments of recorded sounds on magnetic tape. In the mid-1950s, Max Mathews, an American musician and inventor, credited with being the father of digital music, was working at Bell Labs, where he developed and introduced Music 1, the first digital music language for computers. The stage is now set for the modern music era. Microphones, loudspeakers, and electronic amplifiers are all well established. We have electronic recording and reproduction of music, the sales and distribution of recorded music on discs, and electronic instruments ready to burst on the scene. And, though it is still in the background and the murky labs of academic institutions, a computer language for music is emerging. And importantly, institutions, manufacturing and broadcasting corporations are all gearing up to the new audio technologies, ready to be a part of this expansion of the music world. From the 1950s to the current times, there has been a great deal of innovation in many areas. So let's think of this development as a growing tree of electronic music. With the pre-1950 roots established, that is, sound recording and playback, magnetic tape, music distribution on vinyl disc, electronic amplification with loudspeakers, microphones, experimental synthesizers, new electronic instruments, automatic player pianos, and the beginnings of research into digital audio and control, we can now look at the branches of electronic music that have matured over the last 60 years or so. These would be analog synthesizers and sequencing, MIDI, digital audio recording, sampling, digital synthesizers and digital signal processing, MP3 and digital audio compression, digital scoring of music, and of course the integrated computer-based digital audio workstation where it all takes place. Let's take a closer look. It might be helpful to look at our branches in terms of the time period over which they developed. For example, the 20 years from 1960 was the age of the synthesizers. The 1980s marked the age of MIDI. Digital audio started to have a widespread impact on the music industry from the end of the 80s, and by the year 2000 we are well into the age of the fully integrated computer-based digital audio workstation. Here are some important landmark events that help identify these ages. The period from about 1960 through to the 1980s saw the increasing appearance of synthesizers on music store shelves alongside guitars, drums, horns, etc. In 1964, Robert Moog introduced a series of large modular synthesizers that used voltage-controlled oscillators, filters and amplifiers, providing a workable model for sound synthesis. And after the commercial release of his compact version, the Mini Moog, to music stores in 1970, his name became synonymous with synthesizers, and the Mini Moog was soon joined in the stores by models from manufacturers like Korg, Roland, Yamaha, Oberheim, ARP, Sequential Circuits, to name just a few. Though these analog synthesizers were electronic instruments, they still behaved like acoustic instruments in that they were played by a musician and recorded with a mic placed in front of the amp loudspeaker. But more importantly, they introduced a range of new and exciting sounds to the world of popular and experimental music, as they became part of the instrumental lineup of bands and artists. The new electronic sounds were everywhere. With the synthesizers, a couple of new concepts also came along, and one was polyphony. Due to the limited internal electronic resources of these instruments, they were, at first anyway, monophonic, that is, only able to play or generate the sounds for one note at a time. Though this was in some ways a strange musical limitation, it did have a unique audio quality which skillful keyboard players were able to exploit creatively. Towards 1980, as technology developed, the big polyphonic synths, able to play multiple notes, like Yamaha's CS80, Sequential Circuit's Prophet 5 and 6, Roland's Jupiter 8, the Oberheim Matrix, and so on, appeared on the scene. A second concept introduced by some synths was step sequencing, or automatic note playing, hinting in a way at computer music. Auxiliary voltage-controlled oscillators were being used to create automatically changing pitches in the main oscillators, generating a repetitive series or sequence of notes. Again, this sound became part of the synthesizer music scene and was in some ways a forerunner of MIDI sequencing. As we move into the early 80s, digital technology became central to the synthesizer world, bringing new benefits and functionality. For example, microprocessor control, first overtly used on the Prophet 5, allowed users to digitally store the sounds that they created in memories or patches, recalling these sounds at the touch of a button. Also, new methods of sound generation became possible, and one important new synthesis method was FM, discovered by John Chowning at Stanford over 10 years earlier, but finding enormous success when Yamaha, who bought the patent, released the DX7 synth in 1983 with its 128 pre-made onboard sounds. And as one of the creators of those factory presets, I remember well the excitement of diving into FM synthesis and bringing those sounds to life. And then, of course, there was sampling, which emerged in the early 80s with synths like the emulator from EMU Systems, able to recreate realistic acoustic instrument sounds like pianos, strings, choirs, and so on. And indeed, sampling became the dominant form of synthesis as the decade progressed. But MIDI itself was probably the main major influencer of electronic music in general during the 80s. So let's take a look at our age of MIDI. In 1983, MIDI, the Musical Instrument Digital Interface, was introduced as an industry standard format of connectivity between synthesizers. Using a standardized MIDI cable, you could connect two different synths, play a note on one of them, and the note information would be transmitted down the cable, and you could hear the same note played on the other synth. It was a simple concept, but its effect on the electronic music world was extensive, giving rise to MIDI recording, MIDI sequencers, and various keyboard alternatives for physically controlling synthesizers such as drum pads, guitar controllers, and even wind controllers, opening up the world of synthesis to many more musicians and players. Essentially, MIDI is another system in a long line of systems for the digital encoding of music that was started in the 1950s by Max Matthews at Bell Labs. However, the MIDI format, thanks to the efforts of long-sighted individuals and company leaders, gained the support of the major synthesizer manufacturers of the time and was adopted as an industry-wide standard. This opened the door to intersynth and inter-device connectivity, and to the dozens of smaller companies that were producing musical inventions that relied on the control of synthesizers, and could now join in the game thanks to MIDI's universal adoption. Throughout the 80s, as personal computers began to become a reality, many MIDI software packages emerged, using MIDI to connect to synthesizers and turn ideas into sound. And much of today's music workstation software can trace its history back to these early developments. The software Max, for example, created by Miller Puckett and probably familiar to today's users of Ableton Live, was an innovative example. As the decade went by, the MIDI format was expanded to GM, or General MIDI, which specified further parameters and ensured an even greater connectivity and parity between synthesizers. For example, to be GM compliant, a synth had to be able to produce 24 notes polyphonically and play a prescribed set of sounds. It can be fairly said that MIDI and its associated standardization was, along with the development of computers, a cornerstone for the growth of desktop music systems and for encouraging the development of the home studio. Of course, driving development at this time was digital audio technology. Digital audio recording made a tentative commercial appearance in the 70s in large-scale computer music workstations. The synths of the 80s were largely digital instruments, and there was some stereo wave editing software around. But digital multitrack recording did not really have a significant commercial impact until the late 80s. As computers and support technologies of digital audio grew, digital memory, transmission speeds, computing power, so computer-based digital audio recording became more realistic, and by 1989, the first Pro Tools computer digital audio recording system with a graphical user interface, hard disk storage, and significant audio processing was introduced. The system was expensive and required additional specialist hardware, but it marked the beginning of computer-based digital audio recording, and Pro Tools would become a standard for digital audio recording in studios all over the world. In 2010, Pro Tools version 9 was fully functional on an off-the-shelf laptop. Up until 1990, magnetic tape was still the main medium for audio recording, though some professional studios were now using a hybrid system recording digital audio signals to magnetic tape, and in 1992 this became a commercial reality when Alesis released the affordable ADAT 8-track digital recorder, which used VHS tape as its medium and made digital audio multitrack recording possible for the home studio. There are a couple of other important digital audio related landmark events that should be noted. Back in 1982, Sony released the first digital audio compact disc music album. This established a digital audio quality standard for commercial audio recordings, and within less than 10 years, the sales of CDs superseded those of vinyl records. And later, in our digital era, in 1999, the first portable music players appeared on the market, using a new method for greatly reducing or compressing the size of digital audio files without significant loss of fidelity. It was invented a few years earlier in Germany and called MP3. This meant that mass storage and portability, along with faster transmission of audio files over the internet, was possible. The arrival of MP3 led to many innovations in the area of personal music storage and playback. Personal computers first appeared in the 70s, but there was no real music software. MSX computers, mainly from Japan, made a brief appearance in the early 80s, and the Yamaha CX-5 did have built-in synth hardware and software for music. The mid-80s saw the arrival of the popular Macintosh computers, running opcode's MIDI-Mac sequencer among others, for example, and competing with the Atari ST Pro 24 MIDI sequencer from Steinberg. In 1989, Creative Technologies introduced the Sound Blaster series of sound cards for Windows PCs, enhancing the computer's ability to process audio and providing an onboard synth. And by the 90s, computer technology had developed such that Avid could release their Pro Tools system. But it was not until the mid-90s that we see the now familiar digital audio workstation software package and the emergence of familiar names like Cubase, Logic Pro, Cakewalk, Reason, Performer, to name just a few. In 1996, Steinberg introduced a standardized format called VST for audio processing and synthesis software, or plugins, which gave customers more flexibility with the digital processing accessories that could be used with their choice of DAW. By 2000, computer technology had matured enough to support the high data access speeds and processing power to comfortably handle the requirements of digital audio. Software packages and digital accessory devices such as mixers, analog to digital converters that extended and improved the functionality of a home studio were readily available. The USB physical data transmission format incorporated MIDI and tidied up the cable connections between hardware devices. And importantly, the computer's graphic user interface enabled the development of intuitive audio file editing, and music data could be entered now in the form of standard musical notation, with score engraving programs like Finale and Sibelius introduced in the 1990s. Both the Windows and Mac Operating systems include built-in synths, so their media players can play back MIDI files as well as audio files. And in 2004, the Apple Corporation included GarageBand, which was a fully functional, easy-to-use DAW as part of the Mac operating system. It's fair to say that today, professional quality music and audio production is within the reach of any and every musician with a computer. All of the early historical trends in electronic music over the last century now converge into the personal computer digital audio workstation, which in one package offers audio recording and processing, MIDI music creation, with synthesizers providing the sounds, and file formatting so that the end product is ready to be shared over any medium. Probably the functions of a modern DAW today, which would most surprise those early electronic music inventors, would be the ease and quality of audio recording using a computer, the simplicity and variety of methods to write music for synthesizers, and the range and quality of sounds that they can produce. The degree to which audio files can be manipulated with algorithms, for example, to change the tempo or the timbre of a file, adding effects like reverberation, echoes, and even the ability to correct the pitches of an out-of-tune recording. Music with computers today can be a magical world just waiting to be explored and enjoyed. Here's a simplified reminder of the major developments from 1960 through to today.